Good morning. Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here in Boston. Excited to talk on this topic, which, as we all know, especially in the regulatory world, there's a few things that cause a lot of stress, right? It's getting that final submission in, getting that final package to FDA. We all know the work that goes in, the hours at the end, that final push, launching a new product, the claims are being made, making sure that's all buttoned up, our first touch with the public, making sure we don't have anything that, a regulator is going to find that's going to get us in trouble. But then there's also an acquisition, due diligence, the worry, the work that goes into scanning documents and looking at assessments and making sure that whether you're selling or buying, what you get is what you think you're going to get. You're going to get a product that's actually going to be able to be marketed. And so today I want to focus on the due diligence. I'm calling it smart due diligence, really making sure that you account for the most important things and getting the most bang out of the time and the resources you have. So happy to go in. So I'm Nate Downing. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this. Feel free to interrupt during the presentation, but also you can see my information on this slide. Feel free to email me at any time. So some objectives, right? An overview of a regulatory strategy, the way to approach it, right? This is high level, but if you're going to start a project, start an acquisition, what should you be looking for? And I'm really going to be talking from the side of a buyer, but obviously that's applicable to the seller as well. You've got to be considering this is what the buyer is going to be focusing on. And then product classification, right? It's something that I see that comes up a lot is classification decisions that are made to have short-term gains, but they have long-term implications that aren't accounted for. How can you assess that? How can you account for that in your long-term acquisition plans and ways to address that? Quality system readiness. Quality system is sometimes an afterthought, and it's not on purpose. It's because generating a device, generating clinical evidence, getting all of the funding you need takes a lot of time. And we sometimes forget those internal documents are going to become external at some point. And so, looking at the quality system, making sure that we know what we're looking for and what it means to be actually ready to go to FDA versus having a set of documents that sit on someone's desk, right? Pre-market communications, if you're a buyer, understanding what you should be looking for in pre-market communications to assess risk. Is there some mitigation that needs to be undertaken to account for communications that were made? Also, what kind of communications can you support from a pre-market standpoint? Promotional labeling. This is a very interesting part in a due diligence process when maybe a seller is a little bit smaller, a little more aggressive, and you have a larger buyer coming in and the risk profiles don't add up, and now you've got to account for that. You've got to make changes, you've got to assess what you find, you got to make new claims matrices, all the things that come into it from a promotional labeling standpoint. And then looking at these areas, what are some ways to burn down risk? So when you find some areas that you are concerned with, what can you do? What steps can you take? And then we'll end with some key takeaways for acquirers and key takeaways for sellers. So an overview of the regulatory strategy. What I like to think of is understanding what is most important. And that's not just a regular standpoint. First, I like to understand what are the business objectives. If the business needs to buy something that's market ready, then my review from a regulatory standpoint is a little bit more focused on, okay, is this ready to go to FDA? Is your quality system completely ready? Do you have all the evidence generated to go to FDA? Do you have clinical study that's completed? Have you met your endpoints? All of those things that allow you to get to the market. If a business is looking for something that, hey, we like their technology, but we're going to make it our own, well, now my review can be a little bit looser, right? I can understand that we can adopt their quality system into our quality system. So it gives me a little bit of leeway there. I just have to make sure that I'm understanding the time and budget it will take to get whatever they're lacking up to speed. So understanding what is most important from a business perspective and then from a regulatory perspective, right? Quality system, making sure risks are assessed properly, having a good classification, a good evidence strategy is going to make me more successful. And so there's two coins to that, right? There's the regulatory importance, but there's the business importance. They need to marry to make everybody happy. And then determine what can be changed and what can't be changed. Well, what can't be changed? Well, things that have happened in the past, right? Have you had a clinical study? Have they undertaken a clinical study and maybe a primary was failed, so they've got to revamp it? Well, you don't get to ignore that that endpoint was failed, right? You have to understand, did I make device changes? Did I do other things in my population? Did I narrow my indication? And now I can move forward, but I still have to account for that fast failure, right? You cannot change that that failure occurred. So having a plan in place to account for it will be important. Understanding what can be changed. I think that's a broader category here, right? If you have the time and the resources, a lot of things can be changed. You can change system, documentation, evidence generation, claims, marketing materials. But just because they can be changed doesn't mean it's going to fit with, remember what we talked about in the first bullet, your business strategy. So making sure you call out all of those issues are going to be important. And then focusing on any FDA interaction. If the seller has had any interaction with FDA, what can you glean from that? What are they able to share? FDA, it's not always binding. We can change with different information that we go in from FDA, but you're always going to have to live with those initial FDA interactions, and you're going to have to be able to account for those going forward because they're always going to be referred to. So really focusing on what FDA has told you. Does your buyer say, no, it's a 510K exempt, though FDA has sent a letter and said, hey, we think this needs a 510K. Well, you should already be thinking you probably are going to need a 510K, or at least go to FDA and do another pre-submission to account for the difference in opinion. And then challenge assumptions. Just like the last statement I made, if they're assuming it's exempt, really look into that, because if you go forward and start selling a product that really should have had FDA submission, your whole business model is going to be blown out of the water, because when you're going to start realizing profits, it's going to be pushed back. The money to get into a submission is going to add up, and the resources of time are going to add up, which is really going to hurt your business prospects. So product classification. Well, obviously the first thing to consider is, are you looking at a product you want to acquire in the pre-market space? All right, if so, great, that's fine. But have they had FDA review? Have they done a pre-submission, a 513G? Once again, is there precedent with the classification that they want to make? If there is, that's very helpful. I think you'll find a lot of times you're not going to have that. So then you've got to start doing your own assessments, right? What assessments have they done in-house? So now look at the classification that the buyer might be telling you, or the seller might have stated that it is, and see, do they match the intended use in the claims? Do they match the claims you want to make? If you want to have a device that has class 3 type claims and they're telling you it's exempt, there's a few things you should be asking yourself. First of, wow, where is there a big miss? But also, they might be taking kind of a layered approach, and you need to account for that and say, well, this first iteration is not going to unleash all the capabilities, right? A lot of devices that are software heavy, you can lock out capabilities. And so make sure that what your business plan is matches that classification. And it might be that you've got to do other submissions on the back end to realize the full potential of device. But understanding the classification, the rationale for it, and the intended claims and the intended use are really going to be helpful in understanding your business prospects from a short term and a long term. Are there predicate devices, other precedent that the seller can point to that's going to give you confidence that this is the right classification? FDA a lot of times will look at a 510K exempt device and say, well, we don't think this is actually exempt because the ones that are on market do this and yours goes further, right? And so that doesn't automatically mean it doesn't fit with that regulation, but you better have an assessment that accounts for that and how to deal with that. Once again, maybe making sure you have time built in to go ask FDA if they agree with your assessment. That way you don't have wasted time, wasted resources in marketing a product that's not meant to be on market at this phase. And then global considerations, right? We don't just acquire products often for the US market. We want to go to EU, Japan, Korea. And so when you're looking at a classification standpoint, you may have a strong FDA strategy, and that's great. But if you have global implications, global aspirations, have you done an EU MDR assessment, right? There's a big difference between some of the class 2, 2A devices and a 2B or a 3 devices, your evidence strategy, your post-market requirements, all of those that tie up business resources are important when you're trying to launch a new product. So if you're in the pre-market space, really challenging whatever classification the buyer is telling you, or maybe they're not certain, and these are the steps you got to go through anyways or if you want to acquire this product, to make sure that you are getting the full potential. And then in a post-market space, so they've already got, they're already on the market. Do they have FDA clearance or approval? Well, that's going to help you quite a bit because you're going to know at least FDA reviewed it, right? So that gives you a level of confidence. If they don't, if they are a 510K exempt product or they're not, have gone through FDA review, then once again, you should be doing an assessment, to make sure that those claims, that the way that they're presenting their product is matching that non-FDA review pathway they chose. We'll get more into claims, but just as part of the assessment, you've got to be looking at intended use, right? The FDA definition of intended use is really broad. It takes for account anything relevant. And so if there's a bunch of claims out there that are being made, you want to know if they're consistent with your labeling, if they're consistent with that intended use, because it gives you more confidence that you have the right classification. So looking at that FDA guidance on claims consistent with the labeling and taking a step-by-step process to do that analysis is something I recommend clients do often, because it gives you a ready-made analysis on whether this claim can be made consistent with that FDA cleared or approved labeling. And change control, I think change control is really important. You've got a post-market product. You're looking at a seller who's maybe a smaller player, and their change control process isn't robust. Well, have they made changes that have adulterated the device? Should they have gone to FDA? Should they have been an RTR or a PMA supplement? Well, if that's the case, they should have, but they haven't. You may have an adulterated device on the market right now that no one's really realizing until you look at their change control and say, oh no, you did an annual report on this design change. This is a major miss. And now our product classification, which is intended to do X, it might be doing doing more than that. And you've got to do a lot of catch up, right? You're going to have to do a catch up submission, which is going to be a lot of money and time, the evidence generation, and you may have to withdraw the product from the market at that point. So really looking into the change control process, which is part of their quality system, but this also goes into the classification, is going to be important to understand the robustness of their product. And then, you get into the classification, you're looking at buying this product, and you get to their indications, right? I think this is something that I've seen multiple times, is what is the indication, right? You have a plan, you have a business plan that you want to take for this device, this product. And now you get to the indication. Is it a general indication, for the ablation of nerves? Okay, well, that's great. You can ablate a lot of nerves for the ablation of peripheral nerves, still pretty general. Or is it a specific indication, for the specific indication to ablate an area associated with atrial fibrillation, for example, right? There's a major difference in those two indications. You may not see those, but from a regulatory standpoint, you have to pick those up and say, hey, that first generic indication, that general indication, it doesn't give you much to promote. So if you don't have evidence consistent with that label, you're not going to be able to do much to tie down and get to that exact physician market you want. If you have a very specific indication, that's sometimes easier from a marketing standpoint, but if your business model was on a broader sector, you got to understand it's going to probably take FDA submissions to update those indications to meet your intended audience in the end. So take a very close look at the indications, do an assessment against what your preferred business model is, and make sure that there's a match. And then I've kind of alluded to this earlier, but look if they've taken a phase approach, right? So if a client, or excuse me, if a seller has initially launched as maybe a 510K exempt product, and they might be, once again, locking down those capabilities. So there might be an opportunity for a phased approach. As long as you identify that and understand that and let the business know, hey, we can get to this indication, but it may take 4 years and a $10 million clinical study. If that works, then everybody's happy, right? Then we've got something that you can point to, and we're all on the same page. If we buy it and say, hey, we can get there, but we haven't identified that we're missing a clinical study, business is not going to be happy when there's an extra 10 million in 3 years unaccounted for, right? So looking at the indication, understanding the full potential of it, and being realistic at where you are. And then product capability. I always think that this is part of the phase approach, but really make sure that FDA understands the product capability as well, because the marketing team is going to want to push it to its full capability. So the regulatory team, making sure that the indications and the product capability are messaged properly, are going to really help your team as a marketing be more successful in their initial launch, because they're going to know the limitations of what they can say. Quality system readiness. This is something I see a lot in smaller companies who are often looking to sell, because it's not easy, right? It's expensive, it's time consuming. It takes expertise to get the documentation right. And so making sure you have a robust way to assess quality systems is important, right? Do they have a design history file? Do you know how to build the device? Could someone else grab this file and make the same device, make it the same way? Yes, that's important. No, well, you're going to have some gaps you got to assess for. Risk documentation. This is something that regulatory bodies really pour over when they're making an assessment on a change, on a new approval. They want to know the risks that your device, your product brings to the patient, to the user group, whoever it might be. And so you need to make sure you have a robust process to account for that, right? EU MDR has a very different risk process than it did 7-8 years ago. And so looking through and having the right experts on your team to assess the risk documentation is going to get you more market ready than if you just have a couple of documents that were quickly put together. because that's where I see a lot of people in the last hour of a submission saying, oh, shoot, we need to update our risk documentation. Well, now your risk, which should have been way before a lot of your evidence generation, is the last document. You're going to have a lot of tough conversations with the regulatory agency. Supporting evidence, right? This isn't not necessarily about the supporting evidence you generate, but how you store it, how you prove it was generated properly, test reports, test plans, clinical quality documents, all of the things that you can put to FDA and say, hey, here's how we prove our device is doing exactly what we said. You can see each patient, de-identified, what their outcomes were, our reports, our case reports, in an audit. And so making sure that your quality system is robust enough for all of that. Global considerations, obviously it's kind of a bullet point on all of this. I'm very FDA focused, but still the quality system from a global standpoint, are they part of MDSAP? That can really help you knowing that they've been audited in a sense that accounts for multiple geographies. That gives you a different sense of your business plan and maybe the ability to go to some geographies sooner than you thought. But at least understanding that and looking for that is going to give you a heads up. And then some quality system diligence a little bit further. Good documentation practices. Are they following 21 Part 11 for electronic documents? Are they signing things? Are they making updates properly? Do they have a good quality system that has version control? They're using major versions only. The minor versions are well documented. The history is well documented, right? All of those things that take a lot of time and energy that sometimes some of those smaller sellers don't purposefully, but they might not get to. And so do I need to go and help them redo their document? Make sure as best as we can, fill in any gaps, right? It's not easy, right? Because good documentation practices says we got to do it at the time this occurred, but finding issues before an audit finds them and at least being able to account for them will make it a lot easier in your company than realizing them on the back end. Corrective and preventive action. The non-conformances that can add up time by time at smaller companies looking to sell, sometimes they're small, right? If you have one product, but they still are going to add up. You're going to have non-conformances. So what I always like to do is make sure that they're documenting a non-conformance and they are saying, hey, this isn't a big issue, why? And the first thing we always focus on in any issue that comes in our industry is patient harm, right? So a lot of these pre-market, they're not going to have any patient harm at the time because they should be addressing it. But if you're out in the market, if you're looking for a post-market company, you do need to make sure there's no patient harm in mitigating that. But those non-conformances, they can add up. And so if they've opened up a CAPA, right, you want to look into those CAPAs. Are they aging? Have they been out there for 1-2 years? And so when you take this on, you're going to have a CAPA that maybe has been failing effectiveness, right? And so not only are you buying this company, but you're taking on a $2 to $3 million project just to get the quality system, just to account for this non-conformance. Is it design? Is it marketing? There's a million places you can have a CAPA. And then are they even assessing for CAPAs? I think a lot of companies, sometimes when I'm advising them, I'll say, hey, consider whether a CAPA is needed. Oh, it's not needed. Well, how do you know? Have you looked through the steps of a CAPA? Do you have a good root cause analysis that even allows you to prove effectiveness, right? So all of these steps as part of a CAPA that big robust companies just have built into their process. Some of these smaller sellers, they don't have the capabilities. So looking into it in your due diligence and really highlighting whether any CAPAs exist, or if there should be a CAPA, and understanding how they've treated non-conformances is going to be an important step to making sure that their quality system's up to date. And then audit ready. This is a generic one, obviously, but making sure that things are audit ready, right? Looking at the documentation, looking at the experts, who can account for documents? Do you have chain of custody? Do you have a story that flows together and your conformances are well laid out? Because one thing is you can do all the things right, and then an audit comes in. If you're not prepared for that audit, you're going to have a hard time, especially EU MDR, right? You're trying to prove you're MDR compliant. You fail that MDR audit, you're not even getting to the next phase of a review of your device yet until you've proven you can comply. So, all of this, all of my advice is really all about being audit ready, because all of these are going to come back in an audit. Pre-market communication. So have you seen your seller have any pre-market communications, or do you plan on any pre-market communications, right? If you're going to acquire it, you want to generate some buzz. Well, first off, we need to avoid safety and effectiveness claims. You can't be saying, hey, our device is designed to be safe and effective for this. Well, no, it's designed to do something else. Safe and effective is what comes when you've proven it. And so making sure you're saving that type of dialogue for the appropriate time, for the appropriate post-market time. Have you had investor communications? Have they had investor communications? What do those look like? Have they been properly disclaimed? Are they making sure that certain communications are really forward-looking and it's clear that they're forward-looking? They're not taking advantage of the investor communications to try to get out a safety and effectiveness message, and making sure that they're buttoned up there. Have they had advisory boards? Do you plan to have advisory boards? Do you have NDAs signed? Are these physicians who can give you good input on your device, and you're not just kind of pre-selling, but you're really getting feedback that could ultimately make your medical product better? So pre-market communication is an important strategy. It's important to know what a seller has done, and as a buyer, it's important to know what you can do to get your product some buzz, but the appropriate buzz from a scientific community, from a, hey, there's something here, we want to help and partner with this company to get it out the door. And then obviously investors are important, right? This all takes a lot of funding. So proper communications in a pre-market setting with investors will set you up for success. So, labeling, I think labeling is where I see a lot of communication when there's an acquisition going on, especially of a post-market product. And so we all know labeling is very broad. And so what does that mean? Well, you have to review everything, right? Look at emails that you're able to get to. But the first thing is go to the websites, look at social media of the seller, look at anything on YouTube or anything that's else put out in the, in the internet that you can find, and say, how have they described this device? How have they discussed the use of it? Have they discussed the evidence? And understand that you've got to look as much as you can, because then you've got to put them all in a claims matrix, right? You're going to have two claims matrices. You're going to have one from the seller. You're going to have one from the buyer. The buyer is going to be comfortable with X and the seller is comfortable with Y. And you're going to have a difference, right? So there's going to be risk tolerance disparities that are going to come out of those claims matrices that you need to account for. And scrutinize substantiation. If I'm a buyer, the one thing I really want to look at is, okay, here's your claim. I think it's consistent with your labeling. Now show me your evidence. Oh, well, we didn't do a clinical study, but these doctors, they love it. And I would say that's great. Your device probably is doing that, but I can't make these claims if I can't substantiate them. And that's basic. And so from a regulatory standpoint, that's what I'm going to point out to my business. Yeah, they may say this, and this may be something that's true in the end, but until I can prove it's true, you can't state this. So don't be adding this into your business plan, your marketing plan, because we don't have substantiation yet. So once again, documenting everything that you can find and understanding, just like if you're doing your own product launch, a claims matrix with substantiation, limitations, you're going to do the same thing from an acquisition standpoint. So did I go? We'll go to the poll actually first before I get down to some of the burning down risk. So if you have a chance, we'll open up the poll and we're going to talk about what are the most difficult issues to spot. If you've been a part of due diligence, whether it's you're in the regulatory role, regulatory counsel role, or business or GC or anything, what do you find difficult to spot? Is it a quality system issue, device classification, marketing communications that maybe looked fine, and then after the acquisition, you're like, oh no, we really can't say some of the things I thought we could. There could be another, feel free to comment in the chat. But from an audience perspective, what are some things that you find difficult when you're doing due diligence from a regulatory standpoint?
All right. Can you hear me? No.
And Amanda's just about to let us know the result.
Hello? Oh, wow, yes. Okay, sorry, I have the poll results. 47% said quality system, 33% said marketing communications, and 13% said device classification, and then a handful said other.
Yeah.
So most quality system, which makes sense, and then marketing communications.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think quality system it's just so broad, so many documents that things get missed, and I think that's why having adequate time. Some acquisitions might be 2 weeks. It's a quick process that shows up, a quick opportunity, and looking at a high level. But really the only thing that fixes the quality system concerns is time to dig through things and to have quality experts in the room. But no, it's good to see that my assumptions are at least proven correct in this limited poll, because I think it's just the most onerous and most numerous area to look. Even though marketing communications everywhere, they're usually pretty easy to find, and they kind of tell their own story once you see it. So burning down some risk. So proper issue spotting, right? As attorneys, we're always issue spotting. And it's no different here. We're always looking for issue spottings on misclassification, being in front of FDA, helps that. But if there's a disagreement in the assessment of a classification of a device, knowing that early is going to save a lot of work. Misbranding, adulterate, right? Those are very broad terms, but some of the ways that can happen, the change control process, being robust there, the marketing communications, and then quality system deficiencies. Being able to spot those is going to save a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of unhappy people on the back end. So be proactive. If you're going to burn down it, be proactive, right? If you know that there's an issue with the classification, don't kind of shy around and try to hope you can make it fit. Point it out right away. Then understand the timing and the effort to make these changes, right? If you're a business, if you know that something's going to take $10 million in 2 years, early on in the process, it's way easier to budget for that, both from a marketing outlook standpoint and from a raising your money standpoint. So maybe it won't be digestible in the end, but it's more likely to be if you can understand early on and be proactive how much money it's going to cost and what the time will take. Address all issues, no matter how small, right? The key that I said earlier is being audit ready. Audits look for all issues, right? You might not get a major finding, but you can get a finding, and findings have to be addressed, and they can turn to CAPAs, which turn to money and time. So address all issues, no matter how small. So some key takeaways. Ensure you have adequate time for a full review. Right now, that doesn't always mean you're going to have time for a full review, but make sure you have adequate time for the things you're saying you're going to review, right? If it's a 1 week, you say, I can't do a full quality system, that's not a full review from what your standpoint is, but it's what you're able to give. So make sure you're verbalizing that, writing that down and saying, hey, I have 1 week, here's the issues that I'm seeking to spot because these are the most damaging to our prospects moving forward. Understand the business goals. Make sure you know what the business wants to do afterwards. Like I've said, there's a big difference between someone who wants to turn around a market on day one and someone who wants to acquire the technology for something 5 years down the road. A major difference, and understanding that will make things a lot easier on the plans that you go forward. And once again, I'm going to keep it always saying this: address all issues. A lot of issues can be fixed after the acquisition, right? Not every issue has to be fixed before, but making sure you document them and follow them will make it a lot easier in the back end. And then finally, my last slide, for targets, don't neglect your quality system. If you want to sell and you want to get bought by a player, the more robust your quality system, the easier it is to prove what you're going to do and prove what your device will do, and the more confidence it will give that buyer. So make sure you address the quality system early, document as you go along using proper good documentation practices. Have regulatory assessments. Make sure that you have a rationale for what you're telling those buyers about your product, because it's a lot stronger proposition to go and say, hey, I've had an independent expert come in and they agree with my assessment, than just me saying, hey, our device is 510K exempt, don't worry about it. You can just see from a buyer and seller standpoint, some of those independent documents, those assessments give you a lot more confidence. And avoid limiting future potential. And that's really making sure you can realize the full breadth of that product, but that's going to come with understanding classification decisions, indication decisions, and all that comes with that. So, it's a very difficult and a very nerve-wracking time to be as part of an acquisition. But from a regulatory standpoint, understanding where your risks are, understanding how to burn down those risks, making sure that you consider the timing and the resources needed will really help you be more successful. Once again, reach out if you ever have any questions on this. I was happy to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know I'm right at time, or a couple minutes past, but if there's any questions.
Sorry. When you say acquirers, do you mean like a larger medtech firm acquiring products from a smaller firm
I mean,
and
that's usually
such
how it goes.
challenges?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
oftentimes the bigger players will buy smaller technologies that fit within their portfolio.
Okay. The other challenge, that I see is the change control that you are talking about. A lot of times, when there is a change or a patch, they want to deliver the product to the market as early as possible. And the CAPAs and non-conformances, these documentation are always done like retrospectively later, like a
Yeah.
catch up. And it's a constant challenge to, let them know the importance that should
Yeah.
not be the way.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's tough.
Yeah.
And there's a few things, right? Like there's control plans that you can get with in front of FDA that limit the amount of times you have to submit. So I think being proactive there and identifying your kind of device. If you're an AI device, software device, you have a ton of changes. And so the more you can package those and do single submissions or annual report, because you've already agreed with FDA that these types of changes are annual reportable, the more you can stave off some of those concerns. But at the end, if you've got a device change that requires submission or should have gone through a CAPA and a good root cause analysis before implementing a change, you just have to have patience, right? And that's where it's tough from a regulatory standpoint, is because the business says we need to get this out, but the ramifications of going out too soon are an adulterated product. And so making sure they understand the seriousness of that is important.